Recording. Right.
I am Anya Schifrin. I'm the director of the Media, Technology, and Communications program at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And we're absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this event with the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University and the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University in Canada. The event today is an attempt to get African perspectives on many of the proposals now being put forward to help journalism in the post-COVID era, or even during the COVID era, because I'm afraid we're still in the middle of it. And we have published a report at Columbia University, written with a number of students, Alan McInerney, Leah Alaraj, Hannah Clifford, and Kylie Tumiati, which looked at different proposals from around the world. And we saw that during last year, a number of governments stepped up with more funding for journalism. Foundations, including Open Society Foundation, organizations such as, the South African, I think, Editors Forum, many people put out more funds for journalism. But at the same time, we began to have really interesting debates about the role of government. Australia has now passed the News Media Bargaining Code, which is requiring Google and Facebook to negotiate with media outlets and pay them for the news that they're using. Quite controversial, as many people are worried that this is going to help Rupert Murdoch. In the US, we're having debates about whether we should give everybody in the country a voucher so they can choose what to subscribe to, and then cap it so that not too many vouchers go to the same few outlets. There are bills in Congress right now for tax credits and tax write-offs as a way of supporting local outlets. This is something that Canada has been doing for a couple of years. So we're doing a series of webinars to let people know about our report and to get perspectives on some of these different ideas. It's been a time of great ferment and discussion. So I think Julia will put a link to our report in the chat in case folks want to look at it. Harry Dugmore has also just put out a super interesting report, and Harry's become sort of a bridge between Australia and Southern Africa because you're now teaching in Australia. And it's really useful to have these people that can sort of translate for us, because we're all wondering, what do they do in Australia? What are they doing in Canada? What are they thinking in South Africa? And unless we get together and actually hash it out, we don't always know. So there's a lot of initiatives that are going on right now. I'm going to close and let Anthea open, but I just want to say that we're doing several of these webinars, and unbelievably on April 15th, we're going to have 5 competition ministers coming to discuss whether or not other countries will start to copy Australia's law. So we'll have Rod Sims from Australia explaining their law. Then we'll have the competition ministers from UK, France, Germany, and South Africa. And we've prepared some tough questions for him because there's quite a lot of critics of that law. So we're going to really have a good discussion about that. I just want to acknowledge that the audience is an unbelievably high-level audience. I see Catherine Gichero, I see Shui Fang and Sue Valentine, Peter Conliffe-Jones, Courtney Radish, Guy Berger. A lot of really expert people are in this audience. So I just want to thank you all for coming, and I will stop here and let the discussion begin on African perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya. So yes, it's really exciting to be able to sit down and do this cross-world work today and have these kinds of conversations. And strangely, for a pandemic that took us by surprise, put us in isolation and has knocked us around for more than a year and delivered surprise upon surprise, that actually we're having the kind of conversation we should have about journalism, because journalism has been in trouble for many, many years. And the pandemic has delivered us a crisis. That we should not waste the opportunity of this crisis to have conversations that are really important about the future of public interest journalism. So it's really lovely to have the occasion of Anya's report to be able to think about saving journalism. And we have with us Harry Dugmore, who used to be a colleague of ours at Rhodes University, is now at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. And he himself has just done a very interesting report on sustaining journalism, which you'll find a link to in the chat function. We've got Theodora Adjin-Tettey, who's a postdoc student with me in the project that I'm running at Rhodes University. Theodora has worked and lived in Ghana for many, many years. And so she joins us to give a kind of West African perspective. Peter Mwaura, I can't actually see whether Peter has joined us yet, and it's possible that he's had some difficulty actually getting connected. But if Peter joins us, that will be completely lovely, because he's the Nation Media Group's public editor based in Kenya. And then we shamelessly, I'm sorry, a lot of us are South Africans and have a strong interest, of course, in driving the conversation and rescuing our own media. We have Lumkom Timde, who's the special advisor to the minister in the presidency of South Africa. And it's always great to have somebody who cares about media and sits in our government join us for these kinds of conversations. So I think what I do want to do is I want to pose a question first to Anya, just to get us going, because we really want to have the conversation about the global South and particularly about Africa. But this is, you use the word ferment, and the word ferment is in your report, Anya. There's something special about this moment that seems to have concentrated the mind. Maybe you can just sort of tell us what is the confluence of things that has brought us to a moment where people are willing to talk about things they weren't willing to consider, say 5 or 10 years ago, like, for instance, the responsibility of governments towards media. I know from South Africa that every time anybody, in an academic environment said there has to be, a bigger public role, people got extremely anxious about independence and so on. Why have we shifted, and what's brought about the shift? It's not just COVID. A bunch of things have come together to make us capable of thinking, because I also got, from reading your report, and I sat down and just read it cover to cover this morning to kind of like get the whole thing in my head, that really quite powerful sense of shift and ferment and change, where we're willing to think in ways we weren't before. Just give us a kind of sense of what that ferment means.
Yeah, well, I think it's desperation, frankly. I think that because the pandemic has been so hard financially for so many outlets, right? Early on, remember, we had people saying that it was going to be a media extinction event, especially in Africa. I think the desperation has made people more willing to look at options. And I see Guy Berger's on the call. Guy keeps telling me that I think that in Africa, it's going to be very difficult to get government support for media without a complete instrumentalization. But I think there's more openness than there was. And I think in the US, the debate is a lot of, how do we support local outlets and local news? And that's also going to be a chance, hopefully, for more inclusion. So we've definitely got disagreement about how it should happen. And I think it's clear that each country is very different, right? I mean, if you have a strong public service broadcaster or agencies that are used to allocating funding as they are in Scandinavia or France, that's very different from a place like the US where we don't have those traditions. But I would say basically desperation is making people more willing to consider options than previously. Just like, by the way, people are happier, outlets take more philanthropic money now than they used to 20 years ago, and they're happier to partner with philanthropically funded outlets. One personal note, my dad died in 2013, and at one point I was rutling through his desk and I found a copy of the New Republic magazine from 1965, and the cover story was "Why America Needs a BBC." So that just shows, how old these debates are. But there does seem to be a moment. At least one of the bills in Congress right now actually has bipartisan support of about, I think, 30 different representatives. So that, there's a feeling this may be a new moment, and we should really push forward. And I feel like the U.S. is so arrogant. Nobody actually ever paid attention that much to what other countries were doing. And I definitely feel we haven't heard where folks on the continent are thinking about a lot of these ideas. That's a bit of background.
So I just want to follow up and say, I think the lovely thing about the report is the very strong attempts to kind of listen. The French are doing this and the Spanish did this, and that's what the Canadians are thinking, and this is going on in 4 or 5 African countries. That's a very nice aspect of the report, and that's what makes it really worth paying attention to. But I do also want to just pick on another very interesting sort of dimension. With Black Lives Matter and with the pushback against and I can't quite, these words like paternalism, the paternalism of mainstream media, and, those kinds of issues that have got embedded in a lot of journalism. So what you make clear in the report is that a lot of people are also seizing the opportunity to build better, a better form of journalism, not just more journalism or the same old journalism we've had, but a better form of journalism that allows more voices into the public sphere and deliberately goes looking for the voices that have been excluded up until this point. So can you just talk a little bit about that? Because that's also a very interesting dimension of the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of especially in the US, I can't speak to other countries, but I think a lot of the philanthropy right now is focused on that. So local outlets in places like Detroit or Philadelphia or even Brooklyn that are getting funding from different foundations, but are using that to cover stories that matter to communities that have been absolutely underrepresented. And of course, one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic, and I don't want to make this, all about the US, is that many of the Black newspapers, historical Black newspapers, have shut. So there's a feeling that we have to make sure that any plan to, as you say, build back or rebuild has to include bringing in much more diverse, and more inclusive media outlets. And there's also a whole, Andrew Wenzel is working on this a lot, but the whole public journalism movement of getting out to communities and, finding out what people want to hear. And all of this is incredibly important. The question with all of these things always is scaling them. And so that's why I personally have become convinced that we also need to have, plenty of government funding. And obviously some of that is going to have to come from the tech companies. And we can, argue about the details. Is it going to be a tax on micro-targeting? Should it be a copyright? Should it be the negotiations that are now being mandated in Australia? Like, doesn't matter, I think the main point is the tech companies have to contribute their fair share. And then we can argue about the logistics of how best to do that. So yeah, we can go on. I don't want to get too far off, but obviously attempts to get more development aid funneled towards media, which you all know because there's been that big initiative that Luminate has been funding. Discussion about taxation. This week, the announcement of Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, trying to promote global corporate taxation. So, there's a feeling, I think, that a lot of people haven't paid their fair share, and somehow that needs to be gathered and taxed and then distributed. And why shouldn't journalism get a share of that as well?
Yeah. So just give us very quickly those sort of sources of what are the possibilities of the funding. So, that range of sources that you touch on across the report.
Sure.
So got them in our heads. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So it really depends on the country. So some countries are already used to funding journalism and they've created extra funds. So places like Canada, Australia, many of the European countries. In the US, in France, I think they finally getting Google to pay, I think, more copyright fees. They're probably more experts in the room on that. And in the US, we're discussing a few different options. One is something similar to Australia, where media outlets would be allowed to gather together to bargain against Google and Facebook, which, as you know, before, our book publishers and our media outlets couldn't do that because then it would be regarded as antitrust. There's also a proposal from Free Press to tax micro-targeting and use that money to help pay for independent news. There's proposals for people, local citizens in different states and cities to either get vouchers and decide how to spend them, or to put into the budget money for local news. And there's also been proposals to get advertising. So in theory, in New York, the advertising from our mayor should be going to local outlets, and especially in a number of different languages. Government advertising, we could do a panel just on that. It's worked very, very badly and has been a form of capture in some places, like Australia, I think in the 80s or 90s is a classic example, Argentina, but there are also places that have managed to do that extremely well and have a whole lot of rules that distinguish between, campaign ads or public service messaging, that have agencies that look at the ads, that make sure they're not being put out, right around election time. So those are some of the options on the table, but I really want to stop and hear from the panelists because I want to learn from you today, and I'll be taking notes and really excited about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Anya. So I'm going to turn to Harry because Harry's report focused in the same sort of terrain. And as you've said a little earlier, because Harry spent all his life in South Africa and then has this link into Australia, where he now lives, he's got a kind of dual perspective with one foot in Africa and one foot in the southernmost, furthest from us all continent. So Harry, just give us a sort of potted summary of what you think are the most critical takeaways from the research you did.
Thanks, Anthea, and thanks, Anya. So as we discussed at the launch there certainly are a lot of cases to be made for a much greater role for public service media, and for public service media to be got right. And that's right across the developing world, that it still plays such a powerful role. The radio stations, the indigenous languages, the indigenous language websites, etc. All of those need to be supported just in South Africa, not to be too South African centric. We still have very, very powerful radio stations. They all should have, and many of them have started developing really powerful web providers of news in the 11 official languages in South Africa, etc., and right across Africa and other countries. That's an area of focus where you already have built in some arm's length mechanisms. The problem is in many countries in the developing world, in many countries all over the show, it's not an African problem by any means. Too many of those are still state broadcasters. They're still ministries of information. They don't report, they haven't transformed themselves into true public service media. So there's a series of battles to be fought there that have been fought right since Windhoek 30 years ago, and the subsequent broadcasting charters in Africa and those kind of calls. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that sort of backbone of a news ecosystem, which when it's done well, as it's done, for example, the BBC, and that's an extraordinarily expensive multi-billion-dollar service, as is the ABC here, as is using a completely different model, public service broadcasting in the USA, etc. So that would be the one area. But I think the other area, and the area that I've been looking at a lot, and obviously interesting in Australia, is the shift to try to understand why in Africa, increasing, for example, advertising, some of the ideas that Anya, you've had in your report, which would, generally speaking, for supporting local media, should be brilliant things to do. So even in South Africa and in many other countries, this idea that 30% of all local government advertising will go towards local media is a very fine idea, but if and only if one is able to put in very precise arm's length mechanisms so that there is a neutral arbitrator of those funds, that those boards, even with the Luminate and the Global Fund, etc., it's got to be not just mechanisms for transparency and accountability and fairness, but it's got to be seen to be done, because there's an enormous skepticism and cynicism. You would have seen some of the work Afrobarometer is doing on the level of support for media restrictions and how that's going up in developing countries, and how it's been going up. Fortunately, that's slowed a little bit in the last year or two, but it increased from a minority to majority, saying, our media is so horribly biased and supporting of this political party or full of that fake news, etc., that we actually agree with the restriction. And it was interesting about that. Some of the work that's been done is that a good proportion of people saying that say they don't trust their government. So they're not just taking cues from the predatory political elites that are running some of these systems. They come to that conclusion themselves. So the point you made, Anthea, about building back better, to borrow that slogan, we need a better, more listening, more sensitive, less partisan media. But if I could just focus for 3 minutes, my sort of 3 or 4 remaining minutes, on the Australian approach and the debate, and just take it to a level which we haven't really, it goes right to the core of the debate about the open internet, about the free access of information, and whether Google and Facebook are publishers and what their responsibilities are. And I think that that veneer of neutrality, which has never been true, has absolutely been foregone over the last year, just in the most obvious and high level actions that one's seen. For example, Twitter taking Trump off its platform, in my view, completely correctly, but showing that they have the ability and they're making editorial choices, which of course they do. They do it algorithmically, but that algorithm, those very powerful sets of thousands of algorithms that serve up my newsfeed, which is very different to Lumko's newsfeed, which is very different to everybody's newsfeed. Those algorithmic decisions are editorial functions. That's what they're doing. And then in Australia, when a month ago they said, okay, nobody's going to see any news in the newsfeed. You want us to pay for news? Just take news out of the newsfeed. We're going to do what we did to Spain in 2014 when you tried to introduce a snippet tax. We're going to just pull out, in that case, Google and Google News Service, just kind of pull out and do that. So Facebook did that, what Stephen Hill calls the shock that was heard around the world. And that just reveals that they are, they can do that. They have that editorial. So this idea that they're this neutral arbitrator of a kind of online digital public sphere, and that neutrality needs to be protected, is exactly the veneer that the Australian model pierces. It says, hang on a second, effectively you guys are publishers, you behave like publishers, but when it suits you not to, like controlling hate speech, like fomenting the kind of things that's happened in Brazil and the Philippines and Hungary and Brexit and Trump, etc., then no, we must just let that happen, and they've realized that they can't do that. So, which is why they're pulling tens of thousands of hate groups off. Those are the groups that are migrating to Parler and Telegram and all that. So they're acting like publishers. And likewise, the kind of full-scale shots across the bow that they did in Australia. In that context, and this is the important little intellectual link and conceptual link of seeing them more, not as the neutral arbitrators, but as some form of publisher, even though the editor behind the curtain is a robot. It's a black box. It's a set of machines. And that's the area that they're so concerned about, that I've written about in my report, that that they don't like us to look under the hood and how that's done. But that is where they have very directly impinged on the business models, accidentally, not necessarily setting out to do that, of local news and national news and all news. So that's why the Murdoch papers are up in arms. The ABC is losing money. We've had hundreds of local newspapers close across Africa, hundreds of local newspapers close across Australia and New Zealand. It's happening in Canada. It's all because 60, 70, 80% of digital advertising revenue, which in the United States is now half of all advertising spend, and in other countries it's approaching half, are going just to these two companies, and are coming up with 8, 9%, and even LinkedIn's coming in with 3 or 4%. So you're getting 60 to 65% of these advertising dollars going there. And at the same time, 50 or 60% of people in most countries are getting precisely enough news that they need, enough of those snippets, enough of other people sharing things, just exactly what Spain and France were trying to do in 2014. They're acting as publishers, they're serving up the news. And that's where I hate this idea that Google and Facebook are stealing the news, because I think it mischaracterizes what they're doing, but they certainly are appropriating enough of it for me to get a very good gist of what is going on. And just like I'm not clicking on banner ads, fewer and fewer of us are then clicking on those news sources. It's still very important for all the newspapers, large and small, that clicks happen. There's a mutual interdependency that we need to foster and build, but we need to look at them as the Australians are now doing as a publisher. And just want to conclude by saying that one of the ways to approach this is very much around the Australian enforced bargaining, but the other way is through taxes. So what Maryland in the USA is now doing with its digital tax, what's been looked at in South Africa, where you say you make a lot of money from your advertising here in Australia, in South Africa, in Maryland, which, we are going to tax those transactions, just a fair share of the money that you're making. And in Maryland, a lot of that money is going to the school system. But what would work better, what is a powerful critique of the Australian system, is that nobody is saying this $30 million that Nine News is going to get, the $80 million that Murdoch, it's not necessarily going to go to journalism. It's going to go to corporate profit. So you need the possibilities of digital taxes in Africa, digital taxes in developing worlds, an EU-wide or a regional approach where you're using your collective strength. I think South Africa on its own is too weak. I think Kenya on its own, Tanzania on its own, Uganda on its own is too weak. But collectively, like the EU is doing, we could look at those digital taxes, which then are very precisely targeted at the profits that are made in that country in digital advertising, and make sure that those then fund the transitional grants that we were talking about, the competitive system for digital transitional funding. But as I think Anya's report has made really clear, that's not going to be enough. People also need the kind of BBC model where, for example, journalists can be funded by the BBC. The BBC is funding over 150 journalists, 150 different papers across the UK, chosen by those news organizations, because they're often websites, not just newspapers, but funded by the public service spine of the thing. So those kind of ideas around a digital tax and around seeing Google and Facebook as publishers that do need to keep their speech off, that can be sued for defamation potentially for the stuff that they put on there, that have to take copyright seriously. All of that, I think, is tipping the scale away from this, oh, the open internet is so important. Yes, it is. And I'm a big defender and fan of the open internet and information wanting to be free. But in fact, they're publishers, and let's get real about that.
Okay. Thanks, Harry. So what I'm kind of taking, to sort of do a transition now to talk to Theodora, situated in Accra in Ghana, is that this is a complex problem. So it's, these strands of, helping the news media must actually have relationships with each other. We must think about how the complexity, kind of starts. I think in somewhere there's a metaphor of knitting. In Anya's report, somebody talks about knitting these things together so that we have a complex mind about how we approach these things. And then I think the thing is that this idea that we have to tackle this in strength, not country by country by country or news organization by news organization. So I'm going to turn to Theodora because Theodora's recently done some research on sustainable journalism. And out of those, and she might want to talk about other things as well, but it's kind of the link that I know about. And the very high anxiety, particularly in West Africa, Liberia, Nigeria, those countries, that there is so much interference that a high priority is just for journalists to be able to do their job independently without somebody always forcing the journalism to go down a track that journalists don't want it to go down. And that was such a powerful learning for me. So Theodora, let me turn to you. Please don't feel you have to say what I've just put words into your mouth about, but it would be lovely to hear from you, from your perspective. And then I'll turn to Dugmore. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthea. And so we worked on the concept of sustainable journalism in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think Anthea has alluded to that sustainable journalism actually ties in the SDGs to the practice of journalism. But at the core of that is the fact that journalism has to be sustainable in and by itself. So there were discussions, we spoke to a number of stakeholders in especially West Africa. And their main concern, as Anthea said, was the question of when government supports journalism so that they can carry out or carry through what they need to do in terms of paying attention to the social, economic, and environmental issues. And their main concern was the fact that the ownership patterns in terms of media in Africa or Sub-Saharan, where they were coming from, is that of politicians and then those who have commercial interests. So although advertising somehow plays a significant role in what they do, there is polarized media. There is a polarized media environment. So if government is supporting, there are political actors who have media houses. So who would they support? Which media house would they support? So these were the broad questions that came up. And it is very important to look at this because even in Ghana, I remember when the COVID outbreak came about, I remember that the government set up a stimulus packages for business entities. And then, unfortunately, the media was not even part of it. The media was not part of it. And then the Ghana as a Journalists Association, the Independent Broadcasting Association, they decided to pursue the government to give them some form of packages because they realized that they were also suffering at the time. A lot of media workers lost their job. Some of them were asked to work from home, and that also came with a lot of financial burden because they had to bear the cost of data. Already, journalists are not well paid. So in terms of funding, when we are talking about our context, we are looking at how much journalists even paid. So it's not just the content. The compensation for journalists, very minimal. So funding has to be allocated. Is there going to be funding allocated to, financing or paying the salaries of journalists? What about content? And because of the polarized media environment, the content too is not something that we can tie into the development goals that we seek to drive. So these are the questions. So that in terms of our setting, I think that it is something that needs a lot of stakeholder engagement, because journalists or media organizations realize that yes, they are suffering financially. They need to be sustainable. They need to develop content that would benefit society. So what they are doing that we are aware of is that they go in for grants. And these grants also have certain restrictions because the grants are meant for certain purposes. So if they want to cover environmental stories and there is no grant to cover environmental stories, they are not able to do so. So a lot of the grants that they get, they cover the social issues, the social justice issues, and other important issues are left behind. So it's really something, it's a dicey thing over here. And I think that another thing that media organizations are also doing is they themselves trying to diversify what they do. So a lot of media, the big media houses in Ghana, for instance, one of the top media houses, they have a manufacturing entity. So that feeds that particular media in terms of when they have to pay the employees and advertising revenue is not coming in. So that is one thing that media organizations are doing. There is another media house, which is also an English language media house, and they have farms that bring them revenue, so that they can finance what they do. And so I think that when we are talking about government funding, we first need to look at the independence. How independent can the media be? Because anytime that question comes up, media, even the general public raise questions about how independent they can be because the owners are politicians, and or the owners have political affiliations, or they have some commercial interests in one way or the other. So there is also increase because of that. There is a dwindling trust in media organizations, because people see a particular media house. Oh, this is this political party's, media house, and this is the government of the day. This is the media house for the government of the day. And so if there isn't any proper mechanism to determine who, how, or what kind of content has to even get that kind of funding from, government sources, then we are sure that there's going to be just, a unilateral, administration of whatever funds they are. And then the media regulatory institutions, people often say that all the major actors in there are appointed by the government of the day. So another government comes in, and then they also make new appointments. So you realize that even those who are supposed to be independent and help the media to grow, they have political leanings. And these are things that do not make people trust that government can actually support media. The Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, which is supposed to be a public broadcaster, years back used to get revenue from TV licenses. But then there were also questions about, unlike BBC, that is public, 100% public funded, this particular public broadcaster gets revenue from commercial activities as well. So the government advertises in there, and they get commercial organizations to also advertise in there. And so sometimes, and a lot of the time, and in their content, you realize even their news production and everything, you can see that these are people who are not going to be critical of the government or their financiers. Recently, the Minister of Information allocated a significant amount of money for their operations. But in terms of the public funding it, a lot of people do not want to do it. So that particular TV license regime has actually been, eliminated from the system. So it's a government that is funding this public, broadcaster. And then there are, questions as to, are they going to be independent? What kind of content are they even giving us? We don't think they have quality content to give us. I think that funding of media, we need to really look at the content, what kind of content is being funded in our context, because we have a lot of issues that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. Theodora, thanks. I mean, what you put on the agenda very powerfully for us is the kind of on-the-ground reality in many African countries, and that very complex relationship with the public dimension of, what government controls and what government can do, and that relationship of, who oversees and who regulates, and how arm's length those relationships can be. And those are really important to consider on our continent. I'm going to turn to Lumko, because we're extremely lucky to have somebody who actually sits in the office of the presidency of our country. And Theodora and I have also been involved recently in the COVID country report, that the evaluation, of how well the South African government actually communicated to its citizens about COVID. And that's been a really lovely experience, because we've talked to many, many, many people in government. And an antidote always for thinking badly about your own government is to meet the nice people who work on the inside of it, and to rearrange your mind about some people who are trying incredibly hard to do very good work. So Lumko, I'm delighted you're able to join us today. Can you give us some thoughts from where you sit about what you've heard, and also give us some insight into, because you are in relationship, you're a media person, but you're inside government. Give us a sense of what's going on there and what's taken seriously, and what do governments, what is the South African government, how do they want to address it, and who do they want to work with, and how do they see this problem? If you're able to answer those questions for us, it would be lovely.
Thanks, Anthea. Yes, indeed, it's good to get all these perspectives, and reading Anya's report and even the digital journalism report from Rhodes was quite very exciting. That from a timing point of view, this is one time when we all are dispassionately and objectively looking at the circumstance that we are facing. Because if we were to go back into our way of looking at things, we may not get out of the current challenge that we are facing. Maybe coming back to your question, Anthea, as much as we are credited for doing much better in terms of communication, we would not have been able to do so without the media, without the journalists. So what we have had to do was to strike a relationship with the journalists to see what kind of enabling environment that we can create in order to avail information. Journalists should have access, unmediated access to information, because for this public health communication, we need the media. But on the other hand, journalists were also facing this challenge of some media houses facing financial challenges, closing down, etc. So it's a big challenge that what have worked in terms of our onslaught to the pandemic is that partnership and working together. And I think we need to intensify that. It does change from one jurisdiction to the other, because the experience that Theodora is sharing perhaps may not be the same in a South African context and in other jurisdictions, depending on the kind of legislation that regulates that kind of a partnership. In South Africa, our legislation is quite clear in terms of managing that relationship, so that even when there is a good working relationship between the two parties, government and the media, but government does not have any authority to control the media in South Africa, not even to control the agencies that fund media in South Africa, like the Media Development and Diversity Agency, or like the Independent Communications Authority that regulates the broadcasting industry. So you have laws that mitigate against this challenge and therefore provide that arm's length. That does not suggest that line may not be crossed. It could be crossed, but it requires vigilancy in civil society to step in whenever they see a crossing of that line. And I think in South Africa, that arm's length relationship is being managed better. But coming back to the reports, it was very interesting reading the Rhodes University report. In particular, the kind of ideas and recommendations that they say would come into the next phase of the report for consideration as part of preparing and readying for this digital economy, digital era. I think we really need to engage openly in regards to those recommendations. For example, if you strengthen the Media Development and Diversity Agency and enable it to fund the media and journalists, you then may need to make sure that the arm's length is managed clearly, so that everyone is satisfied to not allow perceptions to create a wrong understanding of what that relationship is. Also, some of the suggestions in terms of where to tap in terms of the digital taxis, etc. I think those are the ideas that need to be discussed. Fortunately, in South Africa, as we were facing all this challenge, we met with the editors, SANEF, and the president led those engagements, and to a point where we established a working group that focuses on the media and is engaging on all these ideas. Currently, it's still at its embryonic stages. We're still discussing the scope of the working group, how it will be funded, what kind of work and who to consult, who to involve, because any intervention needs to be inclusive. So it is at that level at this stage. So these different reports are timely because they are sharing ideas that can be put forth in that working group and possibly enable us to take forward new ideas that can strengthen the work that we want to do. The one other report that we have not discussed here is the SANEF report. That is also a very interesting report in terms of journalism during this COVID period. So I am hoping that we can look at all this body of all these reports, what ideas come out of them, and see what good can we extract out of them and shape the future. For me, the take home is we need to move away from our comfort zones. Because if we don't, if we go with our conservative ideas, either way, we may end up having a situation where media dies, and no democracy will be able to survive if media dies. This is the cornerstone of our democracy. We need to have media. We need to have, as Theodora was saying, journalists need to have to be paid worthy to the work that they are doing, and the generalization of newsroom is not going to help us. So what ideas do we all need to sustain that? But key, my last point is, key is diversity, pluralism. As we going to be celebrating 40 years of the Windhoek Declaration, that pluralism of voices, media diversity is key. This is the time where we need to get out of our comfort zones, look at the market structure. Is the market structure that we have, in particular in the South African context, is it enabling media diversity? And we must confront this discussion openly and not be caught in, Theodora, in South Africa, we've got a different challenge. Here is more the monopolies, the commercial monopolies that are in control of our narratives, more than politicians, because our laws do not allow politicians to own and control media houses, in particular in broadcasting. So therefore, we have a different situation, except the message is still the same, that we need to diversify the media landscape and make sure that we create arm's length rules that will mitigate that and avoid situations where then that could move from one monopoly. My parting shot in terms of looking at all these reports. Anthea?
Lumpo, yeah, we lost you there for a little bit, but we did get you back again. So thanks, yes. So we definitely got the points you were making. We are going to open up to the audience now to pose questions and to put forward comments. Please make, either you can use the chat function or you can put your hand up, and there are a few of us and we can try and sort of manage the group. But I think I do want to pick up, I wanted to just take your point, Lumko, that quite often we are living in a different time. We're living in a different, it strikes me, and I'm not living in West Africa like Theodora is. And that was fairly eye-opening for me to listen to a lot of those participants speak about their circumstances. But we do have to rethink our circumstances and our relationships. And one of the points you made was about law. So sometimes the two at arm's length law in South Africa means that a better government relationship is not entirely possible. But I don't want to get deeply down that track because that's South Africa specific. But I do want to pick up with Anya, because one of the points that was made, Anya, in your report was, you know, let's keep our eye on the legislation. Because the legislation, and of course, you know, in relation to big tech, of course, this is going to be absolutely critical. But there's other kinds of recovery legislation and coming out of COVID legislation and making a different world legislation. And never, you know, let's not forget, COVID created this kind of pressure cooker of a crisis, but we've got a longer simmering crisis, which is around environmental degradation and the gradual loss of all those things that have driven growth, you know. So these moments where we can get into the legislation and keep an eye on that seems to me important too. And your report does touch on that. Do you want to just give us just a minute or two on, you know, why that's critical?
Well, I thought Theodora's point that the Ghanaian government's COVID stimulus didn't include journalism was fascinating. And, you know, listening to all of you, there's so many things that you're saying that I really wish I had known and could have put in the report, including, Lumko, your point about the South African government working group on this topic. So it seems to me to be really significant, because there may be ways that people on this group will be able to assist or help with briefing or thinking through some of these questions. I think there had been, in the US as well, the first stimulus under Trump didn't include media. And so there has been a push now to try to get media and journalism included in the next stimulus and infrastructure bills. You know, I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I think that's definitely an entry point that we can all try to look for. And I think that staying in touch with the European regulators is going to be essential, because it's so clear that they're ahead on all of these questions of taxing tech, breaking up the monopolies. The UK and the EU both released draft legislation in December, Digital Services Act, and I can't remember the name of the UK legislation, but someone else I'm sure in the room will, or Julia can put it in the chat. So I think all of those are going to be things that we have to sort of keep an eye on and work on very quickly. Good. Thank you. I see some really interesting conversations in the chat, and people are putting in more information about recent reports and things like that.
I was going to say, keep your eye on the chat, because people are Harry's put in an interesting article that he referred to, and the SEMA report, which is extremely interesting about regional cooperation. So can I just, Lumko, go back to you with a question about Africa cooperation, because it does seem to me, from what both Anya and Harry said out of their reports and their research, that no country can tackle these big problems facing the survival of the media alone. Do you have any insight into whether the South African government is talking about media issues more broadly across Africa? Would you be able to say anything on that?
Broadly, Anthea, yes, indeed, they always are talks at the different forums in terms of how do we enhance our democracies for the economic reconstruction and recovery plans. We need to create an environment that will enhance our democracies, and media is clearly key. And if we have to digitize, connect all our citizens and communities, media will play a bigger role in then ensuring that access to information and communication is therefore the key to everyone for participatory democracy. The one reality from the point that was made by Harry is perhaps it may first require different countries to look at their constitutional framework and their laws, and then based on that, the different regions can be able to shape a digital, but I think that may take longer, depending on whether the different countries are able to quickly allow that space. But if we wait for everyone, it may take longer. As much as Harry is saying, we may be weak as a country or regions, but it may be a step towards the right direction. And these conversations like this webinar begins to demystify the kind of interventions that can be made. Because I think at times we just block ideas without understanding what could be in those ideas. So perhaps the more we engage around these ideas, the more we may then ease the conversations and then enable more people to participate and even shape ideas that could be acceptable to all. So it is a possibility. And just one last point, Anya, I forgot to add that one of the key things that we did in South Africa during lockdowns was to recognize journalists as essential workers, because that also went a long way in ensuring that people get to know, to participate, and to drive even the regulations that we had to shape. They had to have input from people, and the work of journalists was very helpful towards that end.
Thanks, Lumko. And it's to the South African government's great credit that they immediately recognized that the right kind of information getting into people's hands around the pandemic was absolutely crucial, and didn't even hesitate to make journalists essential workers. Okay, so we do have a question which has come to us from Shuei. Harry spoke of platforms stealing the news, but I see it more like stealing audience attention. Harry, do you see it? The research looks at an impressive range of structural interventions for the supply side, but I wonder what you've seen on the flip side of the coin. What is the scope for structural approaches to stimulating or incentivizing demand for journalism? This is a very nice question. I'm based in the UK with the BBC, but it's losing the fight for audiences and attention. Okay, that's an interesting question. You want to take that on, Harry, and just think about that for a bit.
It goes to some of the sharpest ends of the debates that we have all around the world, and it is about the attention economy. This is the golden age of television. 400 new wonderful series put out. Everybody binge watching everything from My Octopus Teacher to Bridgerton, and yeah, I mean, so you've got an enormous media industry to compete with. You've got digital devices that make it very easy to do other things other than consume news. But I do think, again, the Icelandic approach and some of the things we were talking about earlier with Maryland, which I got from that Stephen Hill article, of trying to inoculate future generations against misinfodemics, against misinformation. Digital advertising taxes that try and go into our school curriculums to reintroduce people to basic civics. Moving from South Africa to Australia, a country which has compulsory voting, you get a big fine here if you don't vote in your local government election, and you get a big fine if you don't vote in your national election. But it makes everybody pay a little bit more attention. You've got to go and do this thing anyway. You're not going to just throw a pin on a dartboard which party so you start reading what the parties stand for and what their policy is on recycling and what are they planning to do about local schooling, etc. So civic engagement, civics, etc. are things that we need to. I would also like to see some of the money going to journalism and some of the money going to schools and universities for civic education, media literacy. Difficult to do things, but that is absolutely in the nub of the question. There's no doubt that there is there's some fairly good data to show that a lot of people paid attention during the 4 years of Trump because of the existential threat it posed to democracy and probably the world. But all those audiences have gone. And I remember in 1994 with South Africa's liberation and Nelson Mandela being made president, And in the 3 months after that, all the newspaper circulations plummeted because, finally we'd got it right. This was right. We now didn't have to worry about apartheid and fascism, and we had Nelson Mandela, so everybody stopped buying newspapers. So that's what's happening at the moment. People are going, oh, now I can binge watch this thing on. I don't have to study the news and work out things. So yeah. No, it's definitely an area that all democracies and aspirant democracies have to address.
And of course, it does need to be said, Lumko, I'll come to you, that in countries like ours, where data is so patchy and so expensive for the poorest people, that to have a really functional television and radio service, in all the languages we need and which gives good information out to people as well as entertainment is absolutely critical. So this also depends on country. And, Africa can certainly do in every single country with an incredibly good public service broadcaster, which, as you said, Harry, the transition from the state broadcaster to a really functional public service broadcaster, absolutely critical, would make a very big difference to media in Africa. Lumko, you wanted to respond?
Well, it's just two ways. One question, which is what can be done to motivate journalism. The one good thing, as out of every pandemic, there's good and bad. The one good thing is with the more news, fake and real news, it has forced people to respect credible, ethical newsrooms. So therefore, if we promote ethical standards in respect of our journalism, it's gonna help to ensure that we grow journalism. We, even in the digital era, with all the citizens' journalism and everyone's producing news, but the key would be credible and ethical standards that will then enable people to go for a particular news source as opposed to another. And I think one of the reports does speak to that ethical standards as key to the future of journalism.
Okay,
Yeah,
I don't
thanks, Lumko. Theodora, let's hear from you.
Okay, so I'm looking at the Ghanaian situation where media organizations realize that a lot of those who have access to internet are on social media. So what they do is to stream their news, all their programs on social media as well. And then there is also in Kenya, the debunk media. They tell stories in a way that catches the attention of certain groups of people whose attention span, so based on their research, so the attention spans of people are not that long. So they try to tell stories that are shared in the news media in a storytelling way. They use a storytelling mode to tell stories to younger generation of news consumers. And I think that these are some of the models that probably every media organization has to pay attention to. And of course, it has to do with researching to know your audiences, what they want, and then giving it to them.
Thanks, Theodora. There's absolutely no doubt that if you want journalists to function well, you need to pay them decent salaries and you need to give them the right kinds of education. And if you want to, have journalism that does a quality job in the world, you put money behind it so that you get a very good product. Can I, in the absence of some further questions, just say that in addition, okay, Anya, in addition to big tech, playing this kind of role that Google and Facebook does, we also have, because a lot of the funding that is moving you know, to rescue journalism is also moving it online and into the digital space. But the digital space, you know, if we don't look at Google and Facebook, but just the internet providers and the other sort of digital players are also often, you know, operating in a very rapacious, very fierce competitive capitalist market. So, you know, the digital space is a very, very tricky space to be in for journalism as well, and for consumers of journalism. That was a thought that came to me from Shuai's. So, Anya, let me turn to you. You might not want to answer that question because you've probably got something else you want to say, but then, you know, we can pick that up. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, no, I just want to mention a couple things. To the point about building trust, obviously there's a whole lot of initiatives right now, like the Journalism Trust Initiative from Reporters Without Borders, the Trust Project, the NewsGuard, which is ranking website. So I think what's interesting to me is, you know, let's say my students, for example, all those things that we, you know, that journalists think are so innovative and important, like saying who the journalist is and where they used to work and their history of covering. Like, I've noticed with my students, they don't notice any of that, but there definitely are lots more attempts to sort of show more about, you know, the journalism profession and what people do and the source. So if for audiences that care about that, because I think a lot of people thought that that would help build trust. That was the first thing I wanted to say. And then the second thing I just wanted to say is that Peter Cunliffe-Jones and his colleagues are putting out a bunch of reports soon on media literacy in Africa, fact-checking. We wrote a chapter for Herman Wasserman and Danny Morales that looks at media literacy around the world and regulation around the world. So I do feel like we're getting, you know, thanks to Peter's efforts and his colleagues, we're going to start getting a lot more just basic information about some of the initiatives going around Africa. And I think that will be super important. So I'll close here. I see others want to talk too.
Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit about the media literacy work you've been researching, given that Harry did raise it as one of the issues he thinks is critical?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so I just wrote out a long thing about it in the chat, but I mean the summary of it is, so we looked with Anya, with a colleague from Senegal, a colleague from South Africa, at media, so at legislation around false information in 11 countries, and at media literacy in 7 different countries. And the summary of that, of what we found, was that in the 11 countries, there was a near doubling of the number of acts of legislation trying to control what they called false information, tremendously broadly defined. And the point I just made in the chat was that that was entirely deliberate, according to a media regulator we spoke to from Uganda. So defined in such a way that only opposition politicians and critical journalists ever make any false claims. Nobody from a government or from a government newspaper ever does. So, and the punishments for these things go up to 7 years in jail and so on. But so a tremendous amount of government activity, a doubling of legislation in 5 years. In 7 countries we looked at in terms of teaching media literacy, barely any teaching of media literacy in all the countries we looked at other than South Africa. South Africa was the exception. But that where that is the case, the majority of the focus of the media literacy is on tremendously important subjects, digital literacy, cyberbullying, self-esteem online, civics, all these areas which are tremendously important. They aren't, from my perspective, from the fact-checking work that I've been involved with, they aren't well targeted at enabling people to identify misinformation. And so that's what we saw was a sort of a certain amount of lip service around media literacy, and a great vigor in punitive legislation that does virtually nothing to tackle the problem of misinformation. And the last point I'd make was, I loved the phrase that Lumko used about creating an enabling environment, because the most effective tool that we found for tackling misinformation is an enabling environment that enables people to have access to reliable information. That's the #1 complaint of every fact-checking organization of the now nearly 20 across Africa, and I should say across Eastern Europe, across Asia and elsewhere, is that you can't tackle misinformation without access to good information. You can't access that without the right to access that and to publish it and so on, and to question false claims and so on. So that enabling environment, the understanding of regulation as in a creation of an enabling environment is absolutely fundamental, I think, to good journalism. And it goes to the point that Harry was making about lack of trust in, I think it was Harry, in lack of trust in the media shown by Afrobarometer, when people see misinformation and the media as the same thing. But the report's out next week, so.
Please do make your as soon as your report is available, get it out. Yeah. So this has been a very fertile time for people to do some really powerful and important rethinking. I'm going to draw this to a close because we've spent more than an hour now. It's been very rich, very interesting, completely fascinating to be able to have this many ideas and thoughts, and to range this widely, but also to learn so much. And thank you for the richness of all the things posted in the chat function. Anya and Julia, who's been helping behind the scenes to keep this all together, says they will email us all when the recording is up on YouTube, so that this can then be spread further. And don't forget, of course, that next Thursday there's the follow-up conversation with various ministers of talking about not ministers but competition to take on Facebook and Google. Sorry, I'm losing my words, but thank you all. It's been a lovely and lively conversation. I'm so delighted that Anya, Harry, Lumko and Theodora all joined us and gave us the benefit of their experience and their knowledge. And thank you all for being with us today. It was a very rich, lovely conversation. Thank you, Anya, for hosting us. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.